Hello good humans! Welcome to our time machine from the dawn of humanity in the Palaeolithic era to the iconic samurai warriors of the Kamakura period. We're about to explore the captivating tapestry of Japanese history. Join us as we unravel the fascinating tales of a nation's evolution, where innovation, resilience, and cultural exchange shape the destiny of a remarkable people. The Paleolithic period in Japan dates back to around 40,000 to 12,000 years ago, representing a very ancient era. The people living there back then were what we'd called hunter-gatherers, meaning they hunted animals and gathered plants to get by. These folks were the original DIYers. They had to make everything from scratch. Their go-to toolkit was made of stones, and they'd expertly shape these rocks into all sorts of tools. As for where they lived, well, it wasn't exactly luxury condos. This ancient people probably set up temporary shelters made from things like leaves, branches, and even animal hides. You know, anything they could find in the wild to keep themselves protected from the elements. As you can imagine, there was no one-size-fits-all. Different groups probably had their own ways of doing things. I mean, they were spread across different regions, so they might have adapted differently depending on where they were. Oh, and speaking of regions, the environment back then was a bit of a roller coaster ride. The weather changed, and so did sea levels, which created these land bridges that sometimes connected Japan to the mainland and other times isolated it. It must have been a wild time, with people and animals constantly moving around. What's fascinating is that we've learned all this from archaeological discoveries. We found stone tools, bits of bones, and even spots where they used to make fires. And all these things give us a glimpse into their lives. This Paleolithic period eventually gave way to the Jomon period. That's when people started making those distinctive cord-marked pottery pieces you might have seen in a history book. So, in a way, the Paleolithic era is like the beginning of Japan's epic story. The Jomon period lasted for a super long time, from around 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE. The Jomon folks were pretty famous for their pottery. They had a thing for making pots with these cool patterns that looked like they were made with cords or ropes. That's actually where the name Jomon comes from, cord pattern. These pots weren't just for show. They used them for cooking, storing food, and even as offerings in burials. Back in those days, the Jomon people were living a simple life as hunter-gatherers. They'd hunt animals, go fishing, and pick berries and such. They did a little bit of farming too, growing stuff like millet, but they were mainly all about the hunting and gathering. They lived in small groups and didn't stick to one place for too long. These communities moved around, following the seasons and the food. They liked settling near rivers, lakes, or the coast because, water is essential. Tools and weapons? Stone, bone, and antler were the name of the game. They made all sorts of things like stone arrowheads and knives for hunting and daily chores. Fishing gear like fish hooks and harpoons was also on their crafting list. The Jomon people had their own spiritual beliefs. You can tell from the stuff they left behind, like clay figurines with human-like features and other objects used in rituals. They believed in spirits and deities, which is pretty interesting to think about. What's amazing is that Jomon period lasted for over 13,000 years. Can you believe it? It's like they had their way of life going for ages, and their culture influenced later Japanese traditions, especially in the world of pottery. That cord-mark style left a mark on Japanese ceramics for sure. As time went by, the Jomon people started changing their ways. They moved from being full-time hunter-gatherers to a more settled life where they grew crops and even started working with metals. This shift marked the beginning of the Yayoi period, which brought even more changes to Japan. The Yayoi period spanned roughly between 300 BCE and 300 CE. So, Japan had just wrapped up the Jomon period, where people were more into hunting and gathering. But during the Yayoi period, they decided to change things up. The big game changer was the introduction of something new and groundbreaking: wet rice cultivation. And this wasn't just a minor shift. Instead of constantly moving around in search for food, the Yayoi folks started planting rice in those flooded fields you've probably seen in pictures. This change had some ripple effects. First, they had to come up with new tools and techniques like plows and irrigation systems to get that rice growing. It was like a whole new chapter in farming for them. And because they had a steady food supply, they could settle down in one place. So, you had these little communities sprouting up near water sources because they needed water for their rice paddies. Over time, these communities grew into the villages and towns we know today. Pottery took a cool turn too. Their pottery got smoother and more stylish than the Jomon period. And they started playing around with metals like bronze and iron, which they used to make tools and weapons. Metalworking was their jam. All this change wasn't just about farming and tools though. It had a big impact on their society. They started organizing themselves more efficiently, maybe with leaders and hierarchies. With a surplus of food, their population boomed, and you know how that goes. More people, more need for structure. There's this interesting idea that they might have picked up a few tricks from their neighbors, especially the folks over the Korean peninsula. Some of the Yayoi pottery and metalwork looked like it was influenced by what was happening in those nearby places. And as time moved on, the Yayoi period set the stage for even bigger things. Think about it. As the early chapters in the story of Japan, where they were transitioning from a life of hunting and gathering to a more settled agricultural society, it was a time of great change. And the echoes of those times can still be seen in modern Japan today. Between 300 and 710 CE, the Kofun period was happening, and it was marked by these massive burial mounds. They weren't just any mounds, mind you. They were shaped like keys from above, hence the name Kofun. These Kofun burial mounds were not your everyday graves. They were like the resting places for powerful VIPs of the time. We're talking rulers, big shot aristocrats, and local chiefs. These folks deserve a grand send-off, and the Kofun mounds were the way to do it. Anyway, these mounds weren't your run-off-the-mill dirt piles. Some of them were pretty impressive. They used huge stones to build them, almost like ancient skyscrapers. The fact that they could do this way back when tells you something about the people's engineering skills. But the Kofun period wasn't just about fancy graves. It marked a shift in how Japan was run. The country was moving from a bunch of loosely connected clans to a more centralized authority. The folks buried in those Kofun mounds likely played a part in this change. This was like the early days of what would later become the Japanese imperial system. When archaeologists dig into these Kofun burial sites, they find some cool stuff. There are bronze mirrors, shiny weapons, bling-bling jewelry, and pottery. These treasures give us a peek into what life was like back then, and they show that the people of the Kofun period knew a thing or two about the culture, trade, and technology. Speaking of cool stuff, you've got to check out the Hanua. These are clay figures and sculptures that were dotted around the Kofun mounds. They come in all sorts of shapes like little people, animals, and even mini houses. They must have had some kind of special meaning, though we're not entirely sure what that was. The Kofun period eventually gave way to the Asuka period around 710 CE. During the Asuka period, Japan saw the rise of the Yamato court. This was like the early version of the imperial court we know today. The Yamato court started flexing its muscles, gaining control over various clans and regions. What's really fascinating is how China and Korea had a massive influence on Japan during this period. It's like Japan went through a cultural makeover. They imported things like art, writing, and Buddhism from China. Japanese envoys even made a field trip to China to learn about their culture and politics, which had a big impact on how Japan was governed. Speaking of Buddhism, that's when it officially arrived in Japan. It became a state religion. And from there, Buddhist art and architecture started spreading like wildfire across the country. Oh, and let's not forget about the Chinese writing system. They introduced it to Japan, and it eventually led to the creation of the Japanese writing system, including those kanji characters we know today. This was a game changer for Japanese literature and culture. In 710, Japan decided it was time for a change and moved the capital from Asuka to Nara. That's kind of like moving the political headquarters, you know. One of the big things that happened during the Nara period was the creation of the Taiho Code. Think of it like a fancy rulebook for the government. It was inspired by China's Tang Code and made sure everyone played by the same set of rules. This helped organize and strengthen the government and make it more efficient. Buddhism was still on the rise during this time. Lots of Buddhist temples were built, and one of the most famous ones was Todaiji Temple, which housed this massive great Buddhist statue. It was like the center of a religious and artistic revolution in Japan. Towards the end of the Nara period, things started to change. The central government's power began to weaken, setting the stage for the Heian period, where things got a bit more decentralized. The Heian period was like Japan's version of the Renaissance in Europe. First off, the main stage was Heian-kyo, which is basically today's Kyoto. They built the city with some fancy urban planning borrowed from the Chinese. Think wide boulevards, grand palaces, and all that jazz. What made the Heian period really special was the whole deal with courtly culture. It was all about being classy and refined. The rich folks and the emperor ruled the roost. Everyone else was just trying to keep up with their sophistication. But here's the real star of the show: literature. This period gave birth to the tale of Genji, written by Lady Murasaki Shikibu, who was a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court. This book is like the OG novel. It tells the story of Prince Genji and his adventures in love and court life. Super juicy stuff. Not just novels. Poetry was all the rage too. They had this thing called waka poetry, which was like their version of Instagram captions. They even put together the Koken Wakashu, a big collection of waka poetry. It's like the greatest hits album of Heian poetry. Here's a fun fact. A bunch of amazing women writers stepped up during this period. Lady Murasaki is just one of them. Sei Shonagon wrote the Pillow Book, which is basically a diary. But she had a knack for making everyday life at court sound super interesting. Of course, Buddhism and Shintoism were in the mix too, influencing everything from art to culture. And China played a big role, lending some of its characters and Confucian ideas to the party. But as all good things must come to an end, the Heian period eventually saw a bit of a decline in central authority. Strong families from the provinces started getting feisty, and that paved the way for the next chapters in Japan's history. The Kamakura period kicks off in 1185, and it's all about the rise of the samurai. This time was a big deal because it saw the birth of a Kamakura shogunate. So, you've got the Minamoto clan led by a guy named Minamoto no Yoritomo, who says, "Hey, we're going to call the shots now." They set up this thing called the shogunate in a coastal town called Kamakura. The shogunate was like the new kid in town, taking power away from the traditional imperial court. In a nutshell, the Kamakura shogunate was a feudal system, and it had the shogun at the top, who was like the military ruler. Below the shogun, you've got these feudal lords called daimyo, and of course, the samurai, who were the warrior class. Peasants and artisans filled the lower ranks. One major event during this time was when the Mongols tried to invade Japan in 1274 and 1281. Japan managed to fend them off both times, and that kind of united the country. But the Kamakura shogunate started to fall apart due to internal conflicts and external threats. The Hojo clan, who held the regency, had their own issues, and this paved the way for the Ashikaga clan to rise to power, leading us into the Muromachi period, starting in 1336. This is when the Ashikaga shogunate took the stage. They set up shop in Kyoto, in an area known as Muromachi, and that's why we call it the Muromachi period. Unlike the Kamakura shogunate, the Ashikaga shogunate wasn't as powerful. Central authority started to weaken, leading to a more decentralized rule across the country. During this time, Zen Buddhism became a big deal. It's all about meditation and finding enlightenment through direct experience. This Zen influence started to steep into various aspects of Japanese culture. And that's when the tea ceremony, or the chanoyu, began to take shape. People started to see tea drinking as a kind of Zen practice. But here's the kicker. The Onin War broke out between 1467 and 1477 in Kyoto. This war was a mess. It left Kyoto in ruins and really messed up any hopes of central authority. And there you have it, people. The incredible journey through Japan's history. From those ancient Paleolithic DIYers crafting tools from stones to the refined elegance of the Heian period with its poetry and courtly culture. We witnessed the rise of the samurai in the Kamakura period, the bold stand against Mongol invasions, and the transition of power from one shogunate to another. But remember, history is not just about dates and facts, it's about the people, their stories, and their incredible resilience. The Japanese people adapted, innovated, and embraced new ideas from neighboring lands, shaping their destiny. Stay good and keep that curiosity alive.